Hello everyone, how are you? Today is November 3rd, which is apparently Men Make Dinner Day. That doesn't really apply to me since I'm the only one who makes dinner in my household anyway, but we aren't here to cook, we're here to learn some Overwatch, and today we're talking a little bit about your mouse. First of all, as far as your setup goes, you don't need anything too fancy or too spacious. I myself don't have the most ideal space for my gaming desktop right now, but that being said, you probably wouldn't want to go much smaller than 2.5 square feet or so for your keyboard and mouse. For mouse pads as well, you don't have to be too fancy. There are relatively inexpensive and large mouse pads out on the market, but I just use an old playing card mat and it gets the job done very well. Just make sure that whatever you have is appropriate for your desk space. Don't get a massive mouse pad if you don't have a massive area to put it in. And on that topic, I'm going to just kind of gloss over the mouse pads here, but it's actually a pretty interesting subject. Mouse pads do actually have functional differences, but we're not going to worry about them in this video. It isn't important enough. We're just going to stick to the basics. Next, you need to make sure that you're sitting properly. It's very important to be consistent, which means you need a consistent and healthy posture. If you slouch or if your chair is not always in the same place, you won't aim as well. So make sure you're sitting up straight and square to your desk. Your keyboard and mouse should be spaced in such a way that your elbows rest at that nice square angle and your wrists are straight. Make sure you aren't at an off angle, and your monitor should be at a mostly centered position so that you don't need to have your neck constantly twisted to see it. Great. Now that we have the right posture, we can get into it. No, not DPI and sensitivity just yet. We'll get into that a bit later, but let's talk about this. So you can divide your mouse motions into two categories, big movements and small movements. You can call them anything, but those are pretty good names for us for now. For the big movements, you have to use your arm. The reason you have to use your arm, you must use your arm, isn't because it's necessarily good for aiming, although as a side note, it is good for aiming, but because it's good for your health. If you use your wrist for the big movements and just whip your wrist around all the time, it will kill your wrist after a surprisingly short amount of time, and it will suck. So use your arm. You aren't completely banned from using your wrist though, because next is the small movements. Some people call them corrections or micro corrections or whatever. There are two styles that you can use for this. It can be done with your wrist. Just make sure you aren't whipping your wrist around like crazy, like I said before. It can also though be done with your fingers. If you use your wrist, you're most likely using a palm grip on your mouse. If you use your fingers, you're probably using a claw grip. Basically, the idea is to use your arm to get as close as you can to your target and then use either your wrist or your fingers to make that final little adjustment. Alright, so now we can get into the DPI and the sensitivity. As far as DPI goes, there are multiple schools of thought, and no matter what I say, there will be angry men in the comments telling me how wrong I am, but here we go. So if you're playing at 1920 by 1080, which most of you likely are, you should be running at least around 800 DPI. If you run a higher resolution, then your DPI should be higher. At 4K, you'll want something like 1600 DPI or more. If you're running a lower resolution, like 1280 by 720, then 400 DPI would be okay. Remember that all those old Quake pros that everyone likes to reference with 400 or 200 DPI or something like that, they were all playing on very small resolutions. So, okay, I know I just started a war in the comments or whatever about pixel skipping and acceleration and blah, 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 all that stuff, but what I said is just generally accepted principles that are at least guaranteed to not give you problems. They'll be fine. But pixel skipping and all that mumbo-jumbo stuff isn't really the most important thing for me. I think the most important thing is to have your desktop cursor, you know, the one that you use to do normal things like work, go browse the internet, just on your normal desktop. Your desktop cursor should be roughly in the same ballpark as your in-game sensitivity. Yes, I know it's a 2D environment versus a 3D environment, but you can make them feel somewhat similar. For me, I find 1600 DPI on my desktop to be the most comfortable. I've used that for years. That's what I use to do work with. That's just all the computers I've ever used. I always have my mouse pointer at 1600 DPI with the standard Windows settings, minus the acceleration, of course. Now, could you technically use a DPI switch to make your in-game DPI different from your desktop DPI? Yes, technically. Would it be a huge pain? Yes, generally. So I just use whatever DPI I think is comfortable for my desktop, and I think that you should as well. It's important to have, and I know it's not technically a consistent thing because it's 2D versus 3D, but I like to have that consistency between my desktop and my game. And I feel like that consistency trumps any like little tiny minute pixel perfect detail of your DPI setting. And that's what I use in OSU as well, for any of you wondering that. So moving away from that as fast as we possibly can, next let's talk about your sensitivity. So sensitivity is like a multiplier for your DPI. For example, 1 sense at 1600 DPI is the same as 2 cents at 800 DPI. A lower sensitivity will make it easier to aim, while a higher sensitivity will make it easier to move around. You'll have to find a balance that works for you and your gameplay style between aiming better and moving around better. In general, because like I said, a lower sensitivity is going to be better for aiming, you're going to want to have as low of a sensitivity as possible without hindering your ability to move around. This will be more important on certain heroes, certain playstyles than others, but a good way to test it out is to go into a practice game and just walk around the map. That's it, just walk around. Go take a sightseeing tour. Pay attention to your arm movement. If you're constantly twisting your wrists and picking up your mouse just to walk around the map and look around, look at all the birds and the scenery and stuff, it's probably too low. So basically, you know you've gone far enough with lowering your DPI once you start to have that type of issue with your arm and wrist movements. Another good test is to come into this area of the practice range. The targets cover a pretty wide range of angles all around you, behind, front. You need to do quite a bit of turning to actually reach all of them. So you can see if it's comfortable to turn around and shoot all of the various targets around you. Remember, this isn't practice, all right? This is not a practice exercise. This is just a test. Even if you're missing them, even if your aim isn't that great, the key is that just the motion is comfortable. All you want is just comfort. You aren't grinding this for hours trying to hit all these headshots. You just want to be comfortable in spinning around. That's the point. It's just a test, not a practice. Again, of course, you shouldn't be twisting your wrist around like crazy or picking up your mouse constantly. Aiming at these targets should just be smooth mouse motions. Maybe every once in a while pick your mouse up, but it should mostly just be this nice, easy movement with your arm back and forth. Now, if you've been playing with a certain sensitivity for a long time, or even not so long of a time, you can't just change your sensitivity immediately. If you're at 10 cents, you can't drop that down to 1 cent and be like, okay, this is fine. Once you find the lowest sensitivity, like we went over before doing those tests, you can set that as your end goal, your target sensitivity. You want to slowly decrease your sensitivity by just a few decimals every play session until you finally hit your target sensitivity. This is how to properly adjust your mouse settings. One last thing to go over is zoom sensitivity. So the default is 30, and that's actually not too bad. 30 is not a bad number just to stick with. If you want that 1-to-1 feel with your regular sensitivity, the value that you want is around 38. You shouldn't use this value though. You shouldn't use it. And that's because, remember, sensitivity is a balance between movement and aim. But when you're zoomed in, you don't have to worry about the movement aspect, meaning you can afford to have a lower sensitivity. So when you're scoped, your sensitivity should be relatively lower than when you're unscoped. As I said, the default is 30, and that's actually not too bad, but you can choose to go a little bit lower if you want to. For example, I set mine to 28. Not much lower, but it's just a little tad, just one little notch down. Anyway, guys, I think that's just about it for this video. I think I covered all the important basics. I'll probably make a part 2 in the future going to some of the nittier, grittier details like the different types of mouse pads and all that good stuff. But for now, and as always, leave any questions and comments down below. Like if you liked it, which I hope you did, and I hope you got something out of it. Maybe learned something, maybe even had a little bit of fun. So stay positive and have a great day. Peace out, guys.